Good evening. My two guests here, if I have to announce who they are, then you're idiots, but I will anyway. We have Britain's, is that right? England's principal nationalist, a man of great legacy, great wisdom and insight. He wears a lot of hats, but none of them have a propeller on it. This is Mr. Nick Griffin, and of course, his equal in Australia, the legendary and oft-quoted Mr. Jim Saleam. Greetings, fellows.
Greetings.
Now,
hello there.
Let's jump straight into Gaza and the Trump refurbishing thereof. His plan, and I assume it is to make the Gaza technically the property of the USA. Would you like to start with this, Nick? Your thoughts on developments there?
Yeah, well, I was staggered when Trump came out with that. I mean, I expected him basically to give to reissue the green light, green card, do whatever you want to Netanyahu, but to propose turning it into a 51st state of the United States, sort of, if Canada doesn't get there first, or Greenland or Britain or whatever, was just an astounding thing. It's obviously monstrous because it would remove from Israel the need to finish, from their point of view, to finish the Gaza genocide, and the United States would get the opprobrium from the rest of the world. A monstrous thing, an utterly impractical thing, I think, because the rest of the Arab world, even say the leadership of Saudi Arabia or Egypt for that matter, who might want to go ahead with it, Saudi Arabia in particular, because part of the reason for the Gaza operation, obviously at one level, it's the whole greater Israel business. There's also the enormous value of the offshore gas reserves. I think they might be slightly exaggerated by some opponents of this, in particular on the left, who want to see everything in materialistic terms and don't want to talk about the greater Israel racism. So they focus on the energy side, and the value of that is possibly not that big, but it's still substantial. But the other thing, I don't know if you're aware of this Israeli plan for the new Suez Canal. Have you come across this?
No, not this one.
Yeah, there's a serious plan from Israel and Saudi Arabia to create a new canal from the head of the Gulf of Arabia across to the Mediterranean, and it would need to go through the southern bit of Gaza. So, of course, if Gaza was a mini Palestinian state, that'd be a disaster all round. Whereas with Gaza out of the way, one way or the other, and certainly Israel can't actually exterminate all the Gazans without it being a totally disaster for them worldwide. But they'd have to go in order to do this canal. Saudi Arabia wants that canal in conjunction with Israel, and Egypt presumably doesn't. So just possibly, although Trump's idea looks barking mad, from his point of view as a real estate developer, you can understand the attractiveness of it. And perhaps as the man, the art of the deal, he thinks that he can persuade either Saudi Arabia to go along with it. And if Saudi Arabia were to give one small piece of their 100-mile-long Neom city development to the Gazans, actually, they could all go and live there, as a matter of fact. I'm not saying they should, but they could, if Saudi Arabia wanted to. So Trump may think that he can bribe the Saudis into going along with this on account of the fact they want the canal built, or that he might be able to bully the Egyptians into going along with it, because if this canal is built, the smaller Suez Canal is obsolete. That'd be an economic disaster for Egypt. So he might think, I can hold this as a stick over the Egyptians, that unless they take these 2 million Gazans, we'll go ahead and build this canal. So I think that Trump's thing may not be as ignorant as it appears. It may be his tactic of, we saw it with the tariffs just the other day, wave this big tariff stick at Canada and Mexico, and 24 hours later they roll over. So I think something like that might be going on here.
Jim?
Yes, I think that there are some people who call themselves nationalists and patriots and whatever, and they often feign a certain neutrality in all these things. They point out the obvious, a lot of things aren't our business and whatever, and we shouldn't be engaged. But I would say to you that the Palestine cause is something that would have to be classified as a true cause. And it doesn't really matter whether you're an African, an Oriental, a European, or whatever. It's very, very clear that they've been the victim of an enormous historical wrong, a massive wrong. And it's been perpetrated down the generations now since what they called a catastrophe in 1947. What Trump's proposing, the way my twist on it, is it's the ultimate in globalism. You simply move the population, you make it a Riviera, you put in some new industries and say, voila, we've got a whole new place for hominids to do whatever it is that hominids want to do. It's arriving at a time when, according to the globalists, nationalism is running its course, the identity of peoples is running its course, but the Palestinians refuse to die. And from a general point of view, well, hats off to them. They're quite right to take that particular view. It also suggests too that there's an odd contradiction brewing in the way in which Zionism operates. I've often written that there's nothing modern about Zionism. It's an ultra reactionary system, but it's dressed up in modern weapons. As some of the Orthodox Jews say, it's even a prostitution of the Jewish religion. Well, I won't buy into that either way. I don't know enough about it. But Zionism is now on the cusp of also transforming into a mechanism to create a global reality on their own doorstep. This is all new. And I think Trump's silly idea on the one hand has actually taken us into a whole new category of politics. And the only way to resist this politics is the way in which I suppose the Palestinians resisted. They simply refuse. And the one weapon about globalism, when I was looking at what Israel was doing in Gaza, you can't kill and bomb your way to victory. There comes a time where that becomes counterproductive, and you can knock off a couple of thousands and justify that it's the leadership of Hamas. But when you keep killing and killing and killing, every single death that you amass is the law of diminishing returns applied to foreign policy, applied to warfare and whatever. I think in many ways Israel's run out of capital here. And the systems, which we'll obviously come to later, the system has to become increasingly undemocratic in order to mobilise supporters for something that cannot be justified.
Just quickly, who would have sovereignty in the Gaza? I don't quite understand. Would the UN, and then they'd have to vote on it, and it's possible that wouldn't be approved in the UN. I mean, can America just simply say, we're having it, and that means they are in a Iraq type situation again? Because if they think it's going to be a cakewalk, well, obviously it's not going to be. And already, they put up huge bill posters in is it Tel Aviv or Jerusalem? There's huge posters saying, "Thank you, Mr. President." I thought they were AI generated till I realised that I was looking at something.
No. No, the sovereignty is uncertain, and that's the problem with all of this. Gaza is Palestine, and most of the United Nations, whatever else we may think about it, is actually effectively recognised a type of Palestinian state, and they claim that this is part of the property of it. Their own laws tell them you can't alienate states like this unless there's some treaty. No one's going to sign it. There's
no possibility that the United Nations would go along with this, even at the point of, if they took over the sovereignty, then it wouldn't be Israel or America stamping on Gaza. But there's no possibility with China, the African countries, Russia, etc. There's no chance of the UN going along with this. It'll just be unilateral. Of course, remember that Israel has simply ignored and continues to ignore repeated firm UN declarations. They don't really care about the United Nations. Trump doesn't care about the United Nations. I wouldn't be surprised in due course if he simply shuts the thing down in New York, as part of his Trumpist revolution. So no chance there. One or two things will happen. If Egypt went along with it, if Trump's able to bully them and so on, then I think that the Americans wouldn't necessarily have to fight their way through Gaza. They could simply make sure that there was plenty of aid, all the food, etc. you possibly wanted, as long as you crossed the border into Egypt and got out, or you can stay there and starve to death. I think they could do that. I think I've no doubt that the Egyptian government would do it if it suited them. The idea that the Muslim countries, the Sunni Muslim countries, are absolutely rock solid, principled and firm in support of Gaza and the Gazans. We've seen the lie of that, because they've happily stood by and sat by and even encouraged Israel to do its dirty work, not just in Gaza. They've shouted about Gaza. But look at what Israel did in Syria on their behalf, destroying Hezbollah, destroying Syria, and putting Iran under immense pressure. The Sunni Muslims are so full of hatred for the Shia that they will happily side with Israel and the United States if it suits that sectarian agenda. So when you've got leaders that cynical and wicked, I think that if it suited the Egyptians, the Egyptian leadership, to go along with this, if Trump threw enough money at them, then, or for instance said, if you take them, you can have the Gaza gas reserves, they would go along with it, bar one thing, and that is people power. I think that the Egyptian government, the Saudis, they hold their people under suppression of different degrees. But if they did a deal like that and helped Israel ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza, they would probably be assassinated or overthrown. And if they think that's going to go on, then all Trump's money in the world will not allow them to make that move. But I think it's on balance, which it'll be. I don't yet know.
Yeah.
Well, the other question is, where do the Gazan Palestinians go? What, Europe? They're going to bloody end up here?
Well, that's...
I know they're talking about Jordan and whatnot, but...
Well, that's why I mentioned Egypt, because logically they would go to Egypt, or as I say, a piece of the neon strip city in Saudi Arabia. But if the Arab governments felt they could get away with that, as they probably won't if they are cleansed, and certainly if they end up in some sort of refugee camp in Jordan or whatever, they will all of them want to come, come and live in Sydney, come and live in London. Absolutely so. And of course, at that point, from the Israeli point of view, you've then got this merging of the realpolitik of Zionism and the utter insanity of Judaic Messianic lunacy, whereby they've got this theory, belief, prophecy that the land of Edom, so to them probably Europe, has to be conquered by the Muslims before their Messiah comes back. And forcing millions more very angry Muslims to Europe, it goes along with that part of the agenda as well.
Well, yeah, sorry, Jim, you want to add something?
I'm just waiting to move on, I suppose.
I want to leave the Middle East now. If I want to see it, I just have to walk out the door anyhow. Believe me. I want to. A while back, I raised a curious guest in your country, Nick, a young lad called Joel Davis, who emerged seemingly from nowhere, from somewhere in the deep ether of social media, to suddenly become this prominent voice for Australian nationalism, while none of us actual Australian nationalists knew who the hell he was. And he paid a visit to a Patriotic Alternative, met with Mark Collett, made a very silly speech in front of them, but they obviously didn't hold it against him. And I said at the time, this has the whiff of Five Eyes about it. There's some program going on between Australia, England, and America had its part in the fact that the group that Joel Davis is now aligned with, and later on Jim will explain a little more about the curiosity of this guy, is the National Socialist Network. Now, he's aligned with them, and they yeah, as for the American connection, they were involved, having long dialogues on encrypted channels and on their social media channels with the American Patriot Front, who everyone and his three-legged dog were calling, Fed a Fed setup. And of course, as soon as the head of the FBI, I believe, was sacked, this group just disbanded, right? They just disbanded, right? So I'm just drawing in that it does, in fact, have interests other than from Australia to the Atlantic and across the pond there. Now, I'm going to let Jim actually ask or explain the crux of all of this and raise the questions, about the involvement with the English nationalists, particularly since recently it alarmed us to find that in October last year, Blair Cottrell was granted a visa to go in and visit them. Blair Cottrell. Now, England surely has some very stringent entry rules, and that would involve ensuring that people without serious criminal convictions, and particularly with a history of Muslim baiting, if you want to call it that, everything they hate right at the moment. So I'm going to let Jim pick this up.
Let's go right into it. As you know, Nick and listeners, some people have had a view that there operates networks behind the scenes, and I know I've read your marvellous material about the Tommy Robinson affair and the connections that existed then. And recently, a number of nationalist-minded people in the USA and a couple of other countries came forward and appeared to have established, to a moderate degree of satisfaction on my part, that there exists some sort of international network out of the USA, which are talent scouts for people who it wishes to place inside certain political groups. And we identified a gentleman there called Jepson, who operates as a man calling himself Imperious Online. He's run a number of students, he says, and he's placed them in different places. And this gentleman, Mr. Davis, who turned up speaking to the members of Patriotic Alternative, appears to be one of these people. But even more remarkably, he was linked to a number of Jewish men involved in the studies of anthropology, writing books about it and all of this. This sort of scenario that I've just very quickly sketched out, I take it that meshes with your experience of the British scene. That would be right?
Yeah, absolutely so. In particular, I've been looking very recently at the generation identity, which is primarily a European thing. But there was a big effort a few years ago, now it failed. There was a big effort to get generation identity established in Britain as the thing for the far right. So we had there a man appointed by Selner, who's the overall boss himself, appointed by Selner to run the operation in Britain by the name of Tore Rasmussen. He's obviously not a Brit, he's a Norwegian. And Rasmussen, going back, started off, and even while he was running Generation Identity, he's not a nationalist, he's a fanatic supporter of Ayn Rand. So he's a libertarian capitalist. And there's other strands like this through this whole operation. There was an Irish woman whose Irish name I cannot begin to pronounce. It turned out she'd worked at Langley and so on, CIA Langley, and she was vetted by membership. So very, very clearly that particular attempt, it all sort of unraveled, and it becomes absolutely clear that that thing is a creature of a section of the American deep state. I think the PA and people like that, the neo-Nazi types, I think they're being effectively run or used by other people. In particular, I believe, and there's plenty of circumstantial evidence towards this, I believe that the neo-Nazis have been used since the time of Lincoln Rockwell in the States, right through into the present day. They're used with different degrees of intensity by two forces. They're very useful to the state, because they're scarecrows. And in Britain, the government now, following on from a BBC documentary about, it was a usual hatchet job against Patriotic Alternative just a few days ago. They're now saying, they've admitted, well, PA isn't a terrorist organisation, which it isn't, but it still needs to be banned. And they're looking now at changing the law to extend the anti-terror laws so that you can ban an organisation, not because it is terrorist or has any terrorist connections, but on the grounds that you think that ideas it's discussing may encourage other people to become terrorists. So this is a truly shocking, or would be a truly shocking extension of state power. Under that, you could ban anyone from, for instance, any criticism of immigration whatsoever. It could, for instance, be used against the thoroughly tame liberal reform, Nigel Farage's operation, because otherwise reform in 5 years' time could be a serious threat to the whole political establishment at the general election. They could simply ban reform on the basis that some of their people talk about immigration and in hostile terms about the LGBTQ thing. So the British state wants to encourage, it uses them to encourage them. And the other section group, and this I think probably comes back to what you're seeing in Australia with the US connection, is that the hardcore Zionist lobby have always, from as I said, from Lincoln Rockwell onwards, they've used neo-Nazis as scarecrows to frighten ordinary Jews into emigrating to Israel. And especially given the success of their recent war, although they didn't beat Hamas, but nevertheless they're on the verge of being able somehow or other to cleanse Gaza, and they've destroyed Syria, and they can also thenceforth move on to further settlements in the West Bank. As the Greater Israel Project literally physically expands, they need more Jews. Where do they get their Jews from? The only ones with a really high birth rate in Israel are the ultra-Orthodox, many of whom are anti-Zionist. They need more ordinary Jews. They can only get them from Western Europe, America, Australia, and so on. And why on earth would any Jew with a young family living in North London actually want to move to Israel, where he and in due course his sons and his daughters are going to be conscripted into the Israeli army? And you've still got very angry Palestinians with kitchen knives wandering the streets. Why would they want to do that if they're terrified of the neo-Nazi upsurge in the West? So people like this, I think, are very useful to them as well.
Let me ask you a question. I know you've written a major contribution to discussion of Sellner and generational identity. I'll just ask you a question. I get the impression that in one way, if you look at the surface of identity, a lot of it appears quite laudable, makes a degree of sense and everything else with it. But one thing I've noticed is that these sort of movements, they often have one thing in common. I'm not quite sure the right way to describe it, but they're like cogs that are all interchangeable in the same wheel. If you read this literature in Vienna, you can read the same thing in Paris, you can read it in London, you can read it in Sydney. It has no national specificity and it has no strict community integration. It's simply a common blurb that's put out, which contains massive amounts of truth, depopulation, replacement, decline of identities, and so on and so forth. It has a blandness to it. And what that must mean is you must end up with a sect, a political sect, because it can't actually relate to, say, the normal working populations in the country where it exists. It has no program, except it wants to talk about identity, which is, of course, very laudable, very necessary. But when you have to relate to farmers or workers or small business people or other people, you can't relate because you've got nothing to sell. In other words, the parties are destroyed, the movements are destroyed, and it's replaced with this. Might that be maybe one of the goals of the operation?
I think that's very true, and also it's selling to particularly young teenagers and young men. It's selling the idea that Martin Sellner created this phrase. He's reframed the whole of political debate, and having reframed it, now we're going to win. Now, it's actually nonsense. Enoch Powell actually used the phrase remigration. as well as the phrase repatriation, and he decided in the end, and other people took it up, and repatriation became the name used. But actually, there's no difference between the word remigration and repatriation. They're exactly the same level. One isn't more or less offensive or extreme than the other. They're the same thing. So just having a word to describe what you want makes no difference at all. And what they're saying is, we just promote this. We have this huge campaign for remigration, and it'll all be okay. They'll all go home. But there's no effort at all to build any sort of political organization, let alone a revolutionary one. So remigration is a demand made of the existing powers. And there's no attempt made to build something which can get it done. Since the existing powers will not deliver remigration, it's a completely nonsensical, reformist, impossible reformist demand. And a key reason that the system will not go along with it is that it's economically impossible for them to go along with remigration. Get rid of the criminals and so on. And they can do the stuff like that, like Trump is. But a capitalist system, as you know, needs growth. A capitalist system which has a money supply based on money created as interest-bearing debt has to have overall growth, or it simply grinds to a halt. You cannot have growth with an aging, shrinking population. So you have to have new people in. Capitalism doesn't just need and demand cheap workers, which is through immigration and feminism. It also needs consumers. And the more rootless, mixed up they are, the better, because then they've got no community or national resistance to buying certain things. They'll all buy the same capitalist junk. So the system has to have continued mass immigration and cannot go for remigration. So the whole thing, making that your central demand, instead of building some kind of organization, political organization, is a nonsense. So I'll let you come back on that. And then I've got a second angle on this I'd like to talk about.
It's interesting that the Saleam group seems to have approached those parties in Europe like AfD or possibly the National Rally parties like that. I take it, and I'm being facetious here, they've never approached you, have they?
I met Selner. He came over when it was 2017, I think, when they were trying to establish Generation Identity. Myself and a colleague, we put on a dinner to meet some of their sort of brightest youngsters, just privately in London, because we were looking to see actually did they deserve help and guidance.
Yeah.
And in fact, they were fairly disappointing. Selner and his then girlfriend, Brittany Pettifer, actually came along to this, arriving late, sat down at the dinner and so on. And my colleague Jim, not you Jim, another Jim, at one point said, yeah, they were discussing security. They're all terrified of being doxxed, exposed and so on, and which is itself a farce, but there you go. Anyway, Jim said, yeah, we do understand your concerns. So I've got here in this bag, I've got a bug sweeping device, and in a minute we'll run it over everyone. You can run it over us as well, just to make sure that no one's bugging this. And Selner was out the door like a scalding cat. It was astounding. And his girlfriend said, oh, he's got an upset stomach. And a few minutes later, he came back in and they said to her, we've got to go. So someone's called me, we've got to go, and they shot out. So that's my only actual personal experience with Selner, and it absolutely stank.
So, in other words, he's never really approached long-standing European nationalist people or European nationalist organisations. He's running something entirely off to the side, seeks to set up branches. I would assume, therefore, these movements are in competition with existing forces and so on.
Yes, that's all absolutely true. Then there's the other factor, and this is the people now promoting remigration and working very closely with the AfD, with Albert Camus, who was the man who first came up with the phrase "great replacement." He's an elderly intellectual French homosexual. They've got him speaking at their conference coming up next month, somewhere in Eastern England. And these people are very interesting. They are at least claiming to be going down a political route. In fact, they've got a few very low-level local councillors already, which takes some doing, to be fair. And they're pushing this, and this is very interesting. And you see a similar thing with others of these identitarians. although they've got the Homeland Party now, they've got a political agenda, they've got a housing policy, stuff which could appeal to the working class, but they're also saying that theirs has to be a sensible and a moderate nationalism, and they're criticising what they call horseshoe nationalism, and they say that this is some kind of aberration, and it's a nationalism which is so socialist that if you've got the left over here, you come around and actually they're closer. The far left and the far right are closer, and that's what they don't. And they say they're not libertarians, but I'm not a libertarian, but. So it's back to this libertarian position, and they don't want to see anything remotely radical about nationalism. And I think a key thing in this, in the thing they're doing, promoting this remigration thing, they say that remigration is fundamentally, it's an example of the failures of the institution of the state, and it's a loss by the people running the state of a loyalty to their nation, and that's got to be put right. Now, of course, there's an element of truth in that, but as in my short monologue just before, you cannot begin to understand why we have mass immigration aside of the ferocious anti-Christian, anti-white feeling of certain people. You can't begin to understand why we have mass immigration, and you can't oppose it without face on dealing with capitalism, finance capitalism, and the banking system. And these people are saying, we understand, all you people out there, you're desperately worried about immigration, but don't look at one of the key reasons. I think
that would be very funny coming from people like Homeland who are really neo-Nazis and pretend that they're national socialists. It used to be a joke here that with most of those people, there's not very much social in their national. And it's been a very common thing. In fact, one of the very funny things that was observed by us, and I know that some people who detract from your efforts often suggest that in exposing or discussing something being so frightfully unfair and all this, well, I've had that myself. You know, if I criticise something or point out something, I'm unfair, I'm unreasonable, I'm a sectarian, I'm just a dead set bastard, you know, and all the rest of it. But one thing that became very, very clear is this dialectic that operates, that the representatives of Homeland were interviewed by some people in Australia called National Observer. National Observer are a satellite structure of the Liberal Party, but their attempt, which is our equivalent of your Conservatives, and they're attempting to mobilise all sorts of, I'll call it, right-wing opinion in the interest of the Liberal Party. Now, their people who style themselves as ultra-conservative, but here they are interviewing people in the UK who are supposedly ultra-extreme. At the same time, and I can't offer a reason for it, I'm not why, for argument's sake, the Patriotic Alternative people who would actually want to invite to their conference people who are self-confessed neo-Nazis. Well, you wouldn't do that. You'd say, well, you know, nice to talk to you on your way. So the contradictions are quite curious. And for once, I would say to you, it's a case of Five Eyes in an odd sort of way, that people in Australia are interfering in the affairs of British nationalism, but I don't believe they're doing it because they're simply idiots. They're not idiots. They're being told. And certainly these jokers from the Liberal Party, very clear. There's even a magazine here now, online magazine called The Noticer, which is Liberal Party connected, which is now taken to calling neo-Nazis and the far right and everyone nationalists, but they don't mention one or two nationalist organisations in Australia. They get no mention. Obviously not, because they wouldn't play the game that they've got. So it seems to me that there's a lot going on behind the scenes to pollute, to misdirect, and so on, which we're looking at the moment, just to finalise on this point, into this really unusual circle that we seem to have detected, including some bloke you mentioned, libertarianism before. The Observer people here were encouraging people who they were calling, conservatives calling white nationalists, to become libertarians. And they were suggesting that they join a party in Australia which is libertarian, which actually believes in every variety of free sexual expression, free trade, open borders. these contradictions are so great, but I regret to say, Nick, some of the young people aren't seeing it, and they're being conned here.
In your study, there was a mention of someone, was it Jepson, telling people drop the anti-American stuff.
That's right. And in fact, he was closely associated, I understand, with someone who was advocating violent revolution in America called Kurt Doolittle, a man who came and went. Now, I've had no dealings with the Irish gentleman, Mr. Keith Woods, but him and a number of others have said quite clearly that Doolittle was an intelligence asset, and there can be no doubt about this. At 1 minute he's there preaching violence, the overthrow of the US government. The next minute, oh no, guys, I've made a big mistake. Goodbye, and I'm off fishing. You know, well, that doesn't make sense either. That's the classic operative thing. Our man here, Mr. Davis, was an associate of his and was advocating libertarianism. You're very right in this. They do advocate libertarianism as a substitute for any variety of true nationalism. Yeah. And I know the history of what true nationalism might be in Britain. I know you know the history of Australian labourism and so forth here. Yeah. This is where the true causes lie. These guys aren't on those pages at all.
Indeed. And one more thing, perhaps, before I assume, Nathan, you want to move us on to another subject fairly soon. But one more thing on this from me, and that's connected with the, perhaps with the, don't be anti-American and so on. You've got this, none of these organisations that I've seen say anything, while they're all focusing on remigration and so on, as if that's the only issue for nationalists, especially in Europe. How on earth can a nationalist do that when we've got still a war on our doorstep, which most of our political elite is still desperate to drag us into? One of the good things about Trump, obviously, is he still does appear to be genuinely backing away from that. But none of these people talk about Ukraine, what's behind that, and the old established nationalist position that in Britain it's Britain's fight for Britain only. This is none of our concern, other than the fact that bloody Boris Johnson helped keep the war going. So it's our war only in that sense. It's not our war. And there's a TV program at present, I think Channel 4, quite big. It's advertised a lot. RAF Top Guns. So we've had literally 60 years when the only thing that's been fed, the RAF recruits some middle class people. It requires a high level of skill and education and so on to get on in the RAF as a rule. So for 60 years in Britain, unbroken, for middle class boys, we've had nothing except a diet of pacifism and pussification. That's all. And all of a sudden, last couple of years, and increasingly, you've got things like this RAF Top Gun. It's designed for 13, 14-year-olds to look at, and it's just simplistic militaristic patriotism of the 1912 variety, basically, or the 19 and on into 1914. It's so crude, it's unbelievable. But this is the diet that these people are now pushing on young people, and it's very interesting that these clearly controlled nationalist organisations, although this is actually certainly had Harris won the election, the conflict in Ukraine would be 1,000 times more dangerous to the survival of our peoples in Western Europe than mass immigration, because it was seriously on the verge of nuclear war. And to have nationalists saying nothing about this is just, well, it's astounding, but it isn't if you accept that they're controlled opposition.
Well, in Australia, most of the this mixed up right are all for the Zelensky government. They're for the war in Ukraine. They identify with these neo-Nazis in Ukraine as if these people represent any form of true politics, which they don't. One of the ironies, which you'll notice in some propaganda that we're issuing out here probably next week, one of the most prominent leaders of the war against Russia here was a man called Romanov, who was a Ukrainian. He died last year. He was one of Australia's leading multiculturalists. All of the flags in Victoria were flown at half-mast. The Prime Minister sent one of his men, Bill Shorten, to the funeral to deliver this oration about what a marvellous man he was. The Premier of Victoria said that this man was like a virtual father of multiculturalism in our country. But he was a Banderarite. He was a member of the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists. He even wrote a book once. And in the current climate in Australia, he said, he talked about the Holodomor, as called, and he said, why is one Holocaust more serious than another? In fact, he did all the things the Zionists don't like you to do. He relativised Holocausts. He also said, and we know it was true until they were shot, some of Stalin's henchmen in Ukraine were Jewish, who did the crimes. He was allowed to get away with this. And he was given the Order of Australia Medal, which is the highest civilian order you can get in Australia. If it was you or someone else, they would have called him a Nazi or a neo-Nazi or a justifier of war crimes and all of this, which tells us on an ordinary level that this so-called Ukraine nationalism is fake, and that you can be a neo-Nazi hailing Zelensky or whatever it is that you want to do, as long as you die on the front line fighting Russia. And this sort of useful idiots from Lenin or plausible deniability from the CIA is what's actually going on. And in Australia right now, they've brought in these vicious hate laws, which are unbelievable. And yet they're ignoring things that under normal circumstances they would call anti-Semitism. So it's a very, very strange, obviously we're moving into the twilight zone, as one of my close friends tries to tell me all the time. We live in the twilight zone, he says. He may well be right. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's going to be the undoing of Zelensky's gravy train is, of course, Elon Musk's Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, and they've been. What did you do with the hundreds of billions of dollars, Mr. Zelensky? And,
I'll give you an answer. You know how Ukraine's been downplaying all the people who have been killed? And I know, Nick, you've been saying it's the nation murder of the Ukrainian people that's going on. They're still claiming the salaries for all the soldiers who've been killed on the front line. And apparently it'll be a major scandal in Ukraine. I think the ordinary Ukrainian people will lynch this bastard in the end, but they've run off with the cash. And I found that, like, apparently the casualty lists that are now officially agreed to in Ukraine are not far short of what the Russians were alleging. And it is nation murder. And these people are responsible for it. And as we've said, it's these fake patriots who have been all for the war. And I want to ask you a question about true European patriots in a moment. But the fake patriots for the war, the real patriots are opposed to the war.
Yeah.
And I think that's been your position now for decades.
Well, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. There's one thing on the money in Ukraine and Zelensky. I saw the other day, Zelensky, his answer is, no, I didn't steal it. We didn't get almost half of it, never came to us. So American taxpayers have paid it, but the Ukrainians say we can't have stolen it. We never got it. Basically, had they got it, they'd have stolen it. But presumably it's stolen within the USA, so it's somewhere in the Democrat milieu. But what a huge money laundering operation that is. I mean, normally, obviously, they enrich the military-industrial complex, but at least people, the taxpayers, are paying for something. You know, they're paying for bombs, they're paying for bullets, they're paying for missiles. But in this war, you haven't even got that. It's just pure fraud. Quite remarkable.
Well, the implications for the auditing being undertaken by Musk are interesting indeed. And of course, we've seen them shut down US aid. And of course, the revelation that I think it was like $9 million went to the BBC. To the BBC. What the hell did they want for it? And it's actually, I noticed on X today, it's causing a bit of friction between these English, European white nationalists and the Americans who are saying, well done, why give, the BBC, what's it want American money for, etc. And the Europeans are responding that you're anti-European now, which is, I think they've kind of missed the point of the whole thing, but that's a narrative that I saw playing out. But once they really start stripping the money, that's going to come out. Will it come out of NATO too? Will it will they really be leaving Europe, to fill its own coffers and finance its own wars, etc., etc.? I don't think Europe, the hegemony there is quite prepared for that.
I don't think people would stand for it, would they, Nick? There must be a...
Yeah, I don't think they'd stand for it. No. Obviously, Trump will keep on pushing because, well, one, from an American tax point of view, he's absolutely right. So it's correct, and it's also very popular. So he'll keep on pushing like that. And I also think that it's very interesting. I mentioned before how Canada and Mexico simply rolled over, and one of the banana republics as well, rolled over at the threat of Trump's tariffs. China didn't. China just responded, well, then we'll tariffize you, and in fact we'll stop you getting rare earth minerals. So tariffs, as we've seen in Russia, actually usually help the development of home industry. They're a good excuse. The government doesn't have to impose its own tariffs and its own prices. It's all the fault of them over there. Same as sanctions. So China has just said, well, okay, we'll have tariffs then, etc. We'll go for it, tit for tat. So where this could lead is that it does. Obviously, Trump is going to try and use these to enforce the almighty dollar over the whole world. He said to people, if you use any currency for international trade other than the dollar, we're going to sanction you, and so on. So he's getting really tough. And from a purely American imperialist point of view, actually, it's probably the right thing to do, because if the dollar is no longer global imperial currency, then the dollar in the USA die. So you can see where he's coming from. So he's going to try and do this. The most likely result is, rather than persuading the whole world to stay under the dollar, he's going to split the world. And I think you'll end up with China and its satellites, which will be more and more, because it's the attractive place to be, will be one economic bloc, and the Five Eyes and a few outliers will be the other economic bloc. And of course, the Five Eyes and Western Central Europe, the EU. And if America is shut into a smaller world, then for America to be dominant in that smaller world, it basically has to break Europe as an economic power. It has to break Germany as an economic power, because it needs the market in Western Europe. So once China is shut out of them, that market's open as long as they get rid of Germany. So Trump and the section of the US deep state, which has now clearly done a deal with Trump, their primary enemy at one level is China. But if the conflict with China just becomes a frozen new curtain, then their enemy, as in the people that they can beat to their advantage, is Europe.
I was going to ask you that obviously we were talking about misleading people, calling themselves nationalists and whatever. I noted that the Alliance for Peace and Freedom met again in Rome, and you said you weren't there, but do you think there's an attempt on the part of genuine European nationalists now to offer an alternative to these so-called populist parties?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. This has never gone away. In fact, it's really the other way around. The serious nationalists of Europe were there, and the populist parties were not there. The only people who discussed immigration at all were us, people like us in France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, Greece, and so on. Hardcore, genuine nationalists were the only ones, and we had a good and growing relationship through several forerunners, and then more recently the Alliance for Peace and Freedom. And for a long time, for several decades, the powers that be out there, they tried to stop us. It was the same playbook everywhere. They tried to stop us just with smears and infiltration and lawfare. Smears, infiltration, lawfare. That was it. You're all Nazis, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't work. And there came a point when the more they said this, actually, the more it was helping all of us, because the biggest thing we had to break through was that the people most likely to vote for us were people who'd given up on politics. Politicians, the most common reason, if you knocked on a door and asked will you vote for us, was no, F off, politicians, you're all the same.
That's right.
And the more they attacked us, the more it made people think, well, perhaps they're different because all the others hate them. And it was actually helping us. And the moment that changed it and they stopped us was when they found that actually this isn't working. What we have to do is give the voters a softer alternative, a more respectable alternative, a more credible alternative, and our media talk it up. And the classic example from our point of view is the British National Party was stopped not by anything other than UKIP, Nigel Farage, because it's a more credible and softer operation. And they've done the same all over, with France being an interesting thing because they're Jean-Marie Le Pen's nationalism. It wasn't as radical as ours. And it was to a large extent civic, but it was a very genuine French nationalism. And Marine Le Pen was clearly approached and she was given the option. So now she is running the Zionist nationalist light national rally. But everywhere else, the nationalists were stopped, basically like in Germany, the NPD, which is involved with the Alliance for Peace and Freedom, was stopped by Alternative für Deutschland, which is the soft populist alternative. So yes, we didn't offer an alternative to the populists. We were there before them. Since the populists have arisen, we offer an alternative to the populists, which is a very hard furrow to plough while the populists aren't in government, because they can promise or imply the earth, and they're still, more respectable. They're much more credible, so they take the votes. So in electoral terms, it's virtually impossible. So the only people that we have within the alliance at present who've really got electoral potential are our Serbian friends, because Serbia, of course, is a whole different ballgame. But within Europe, all the parties, frankly, are struggling to find ways to not exist, just about exist under any circumstances, but find ways to be relevant, to appeal to people and hold people, while you're not in a position to say, right, join us because we've got this plan for the elections and so on. So it is difficult, but certainly the real nationalists of Europe, we're still here, we're still working, and we're here for the long haul.
You must find it galling that the BNP called out the Rochdale grooming gangs long ago, and then smash cut to this young, I forget, the murderer of those young girls at the little dance school, who I believe recently came before the courts. And this issue was picked up by Elon Musk, who I don't believe has a very great understanding of European politics. For all the good things that can be said of the man, he's paddling out into deeper water than he's used to there. But one of those leaping onto it, Nigel Farage, I actually heard him from years ago gloating about having shut down the BNP, and now his Reform Party, which I just think is I just think they're all sort of centrist right parties with a bit of a bit of that to attract the disaffected. His Reform Party is being touted as the replacement for the Tories. I'd like to get I actually did watch your Templar show yesterday, so I kind of know where you're coming from on this, but I think for our audience, just run through that. I mean, he's a system maggot of the most putrefied.
Yeah, indeed. Let's start for a moment right at the beginning. You said the Rochdale grooming gangs. It wasn't Rochdale. It was basically the whole of England, and also a few places in Wales and Scotland as well. It's an enormous scandal. And while we were trying to expose it, and while I was risking being put in prison for it, Farage was happily holding meetings in mosques and so on. He never mentioned this. His agreement with the BBC to promote him was on the basis that he only talked about East European immigration, which is really the only sort which we could do with, and he wouldn't talk about any other, and he wouldn't talk about in a negative way about Islam. So now when it's such a huge scandal, yes, he's there poking his nose in and saying, yeah, something should be done. Well, of course, something should be done. But it's 20 years, 25 years since we were talking about this. And if he hadn't been in the way, something would have been done a long time ago. So that's the first point. Now you say he's being touted to replace the Tories. I'd say it's actually more than that now. Earlier this week, 2 opinion polls, one for Sky News and one for the Times, put Reform Farage's party ahead, not just of the Conservatives, but also ahead of the Labour Party, head of the government. So he's ahead in the polls of the government and the official opposition and everybody else. This is, at one level, it's an astounding thing. And once he got ahead, the thing is that all over Europe and so on, all the nationalists were able to get, in many cases, further than the British National Party, because they all had some form of proportional representation. So you get 5% of the vote, you get 5% of the councillors, the MPs or whatever. In Britain, of course, we, in most things, other than the European elections, we have purely first past the post, which means that you can come second and you get nothing. So we were getting our highest votes in Europe in local elections were 14% across the board in the British National Party. Anywhere in Europe, that would have got us hundreds of councillors, propelled us to the next level. In Britain, it got us 50, because that's the way it goes. So proportional representation helps insurgent parties, whether they're genuine or not. It helps them in the early stages. But then what you then get is the position where, even though a party like the AfD, they could emerge as the most popular party in Germany, the other parties shut them out because of PR will give them enough seats. They can simply form a coalition and block them out. In Britain, if you're actually ahead in the opinion polls, you're in with a chance of winning a majority of seats outright and having power. So Farage is now getting quite close to a position where he could cause the electoral upset of the century and wipe out not just the Conservative Party like happened in Canada not so long ago. He could effectively wipe out both parties. I'm not saying he will, there's a lot of time for the next 4 or 5 years, but it's an incredible thing to see. Other than, I mentioned this, Nathan, you probably saw, I've got a sort of an insight into how this can happen. And it's based on the fact, basically, that a large number of Labour Party voters, especially in the Midlands and north of England, South Wales and so on, they vote Labour because they could not stand voting for the party of Margaret Thatcher. It's as simple as that. So they actually agree with the Conservatives on most things, you know, social things and so on. They're right-wing socially, but they couldn't vote for the Tories, so they've got to vote the Labour Party to keep the Tories out. And huge numbers of Tory voters, on the other hand, are disgusted with their party and its, you know, liberalism and its obsession with diversity and Boris Johnson, etc., etc. But they've got to vote for it because the Labour Party is even worse. And I hate the party I'm voting for, but the other, even worse, has been the default position, probably the majority of the electorate for now 20 years. And we had this in the city of Stoke, where there was a mayoral election, very powerful position. The Labour Party created it as part of their devolution and so on, because they thought it's a rotten borough, it's a rotten seat, they'll always win it. And the BNP came along, and we came fairly close in the first election for this thing, but not close enough to win. And the way that the electoral system for this worked was a first and second preference vote. And in order to, so everyone had 2 votes for their first preference and their second preference. But in order for your second preference votes to count, to be counted, you had to be either first or second. So it was a 2-round election in effect. First preference votes determined who was first and second and got the second preference votes counted. And then it was the total of the first and second preference votes that decided who won. And in the second of the Stoke mayoral elections, we missed, through various acts of fraud, we missed by a couple of hundred votes in a huge area, being second. We were third behind the Tories by a couple of hundred votes. So our second preference votes were never counted. And therefore, we weren't present in that section of the count as observers. But one of our people overheard 2 very senior Labour officials coming out at the end of the final count, which they won, saying the untold story of the night, and the one that must be never told, was the huge fascist second preference vote. Because what happened there was almost all the Tory voters thinking, well, if the Tories don't win, who do I want in? Not Labour Party, the BNP will keep them out. And all the Conservative voters, all the Labour voters thinking, well, I can vote Labour to keep the Tories out, but if the Labour Party don't win, who do I want? Who's my second choice? The BNP. So a majority of Labour and Conservative voters gave the BNP their second preference vote. Now, it's the same people, it's the same mentality, essentially, which is now looking at reform and thinking, hell, these people are different, and actually I'm happier about them. And if they were going to come second or third, they would have given them a second preference vote. But when you're in a first past the vote system, first past the post system, if they're going into the election clearly in the lead, millions of prior Conservative voters and millions of Labour voters and millions of people who've given up voting because they hate the political elite, they're all going to coalesce and vote reform, and they could give them an enormous swamping majority.
Yeah.
In one way, it's sickening. It'll be a bit like Trump, basically. He's Trump's bestie over here. It'll be that same sort of thing. It puts Britain, can we be more firmly part of Five Eyes? Really,
well, it's chaos factor.
It's going to be, from my point of view, I don't really care anymore. I'm just going to buy some popcorn and watch this.
That's what I do on election night.
Well, gentlemen, I say this to you, right? The obviously the artifice of Parliament is an irrelevant. It's an irrelevant entity. It was created for the industrialised age. It has not transferred through to this third phase, this unnamed phase, which would be a transitory phase. We don't know what it is. Some might call it the digital, the intelligence, artificial intelligence, whatever. But one thing's for sure, the habits of people as communities are dissolved and migrate online into subcultures, etc. We've seen politics become a generational divider. And so you'll note that a lot of these groups that we've discussed, you know, these young neo-Nazis, etc., they're part of an online phenomenon. And, you know, when they do step into the corporeal world, etc., it is in the regimentation of their generational bias. So words of wisdom from you two elders, because obviously I'm too young and handsome to be considered one of you guys, yeah. But your wisdom is invalidated. You're invalidated because you didn't save the white race or whatever simplistic
Look,
binary.
Invalidation's a thing that I think's been operated in every way, all the way through. If they can't invalidate you by age, they invalidate you by something else. It's what the system does. But lately, there's a different trend, which is the incitement against organisations that have got longevity to them or individuals who've been around for a long time. And there's an assumption that they can't know, that they wouldn't know. And yet so many things are absolutely clear. One young bloke said to me recently, he said, you see machinations everywhere. And I used the standard line, you know, the fact that we might be paranoid doesn't mean to say it's not happening. And because unfortunately it is. And I think that, but as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't fool everyone all the time. And I think there is an awakening amongst some sectors of the young cohort and other cohorts that they're being dudded, that they're being given a false message, that it can't possibly be true. Some of these constructions that have come along in Australia have had an enormous membership turnover, enormous readership turnover. And a friend of mine said that that if you wrote a funny article that likened these people to dirty old men in raincoats flashing or something like that, the first time it's a big story. The second time people start to wonder why they're there. And the third time they think they must have some funny agenda, but they're just a pack of crazy people. In the end, the effect of this drama wears off. If you continually apply methamphetamine to the human brain, in the end it breaks. if you're promising people immediate change, immediate growth, immediate action, something like that, and don't deliver it, that's the thing, I'm sure, Nick, you agree, led to those spontaneous political violence outrages that popped up a few years ago. And ironically, while these young men are sitting around the table discussing the outrage, there's an agent of MI5 recording everything at the table, and which is the ultimate in political defeat. So I think the system's looked at the younger generation of patriotic people. A lot of them have good hearts. They want to do something good, but they've looked at them as easy suckers. And that's the terrible thing about it. And
I think you're missing the central point that these things gestate among youth. Okay, so they might very well have external factors influencing those directions, but they are decided by the young people who decide. Yeah, sorry, Nick, you want to say something?
Yes, that's absolutely so, Nathan. I think that Jim, you and I grew up basically where the thing in politics really was still class war.
Yep.
Unless you're involved in race, and then you might think, well, really, there's a race war going on. We're facing a new war now because this era is going to be, they're trying to call it the era of the fourth revolution of technocracy or whatever. This is actually the era of the great dying. The impact of capitalism, and it's not just the white race who are disappearing, it's every single industrial, vaguely modern society in the world. People are just vanishing. So the countries which are the furthest down the slope, South Korea, Italy, etc., and so on, the demographers are saying, if you actually go looking, in about 100 years' time, there'll be 20% of the current population. That's if there's not if you can get to that point without this causing so much disaster that the whole of society collapses and even more people die. Just if things just go and the hospital systems keep working, etc., you're going to end up with 20% of the people that we have now failing immigration, and there's not enough places having lots of kids to replace all around the world anyway. You could only have Africans if you want them. There's not even enough Africans to go around everyone, including China. So this era is in fact the great dying. Vanishing of 8% of the population, that's 2 Black Deaths. 2 Black Deaths in 100 years. That's what's going to be the thing. And we're already in the stages of this. And this is starting to already lead, and this is the point, Nathan, of what you were saying, I think, that young people already at a certain level, it's not yet conscious, I think, to any extent, they are going to be more and more taxed and more put upon to pay more and more money for more and more old buggers who let it all happen in the first place. So there's a genuine reason for young people, especially young men, to tend to turn against their elders, which is a very dangerous thing because they lack the wisdom then, which tends to come, as Jim and I show very clearly, with being so old. We're going to replace class war with age war, as the old people who've got the democratic majority try and insist with that democratic majority that the young people pay their pensions and wipe their asses, and the young people who are the ones who are doing the work, paying the taxes, etc., do not have the political power, but they've got the economic power and the social power, because old people don't have either, to try and do something about it. But how do they do something about it when democracy can't work for them? Because they're a minority, because of the demographics. And there was a fascinating opinion poll was shown just the other day. The majority of Generation Z in Britain now think that Britain should have a dictatorship because it'd be better than a democracy. Seems incredible from older people, but you put from the point of view of a young person, of course it makes sense. As long as the dictatorship was working for you and not for that vast block of old voters who are going to vote that you've got to be taxed more to pay for them, it makes sense. So I think that it's being exploited, of course, as the negation thing for people like us and so on. But it's also a sort of natural outcome. It's a political outcome. Politics often comes from economics, and we agree with that without being Marxists. And economics is now going to be dwarfed by and run by demographics. So therefore, it's going to be run by this. So you're going to see among young people a desire for dictators. We've just seen that Donald Trump took a huge proportion of young people's votes. Trump, I think, in a way, shows the future. It's Caesarism. And you get Caesarism. It's not going to work. It's not going to change things to any extent. Trump could perhaps save America if he, I think I might have mentioned this in the last show, if he, some way down the line, basically opens America's doors to all the educated young people of the whole Europe. He could have 30, 40 million new, basically white Americans in there within 5 years. And it actually would regenerate America to a huge extent. But even there, in the end, America goes down this same demographic black hole. The only possible solution, there is a possible solution, I think, to this great dying, and that would be if the potential of robotics, AI, etc., was used to replace the missing people as workers, then we could do it. But for one thing, it comes back to the absolute crux of it. We've got a banking system that needs consumers, that needs vast amounts of money. And the only way that our species, in fact, can survive in a civilized way 100 years down the line is if the money system has been utterly changed so that it actually works in a totally different way to how it does now. Whether that can be done or not, I don't know. One thing I do, Donald Trump and his ilk will not do it.
No,
well,
obviously not.
Mate, what you're talking about there with the younger people paying the taxes, etc., well, isn't that an industrial era scenario? Because you're suggesting that if AI replaces workers, well, it is replacing workers. And I know as a writer, and that was my métier, journalist, writer, editor, purveyor of smut. It's you've seen it. You mentioned on your show yesterday what a fabulous tool AI is for research, and I'm currently writing a very big project at the moment, and I've found it invaluable for reductive duties, for reducing the amount of research needed to direct me to a particular place. Well, that's one sphere. You can imagine, I've got this idea, wouldn't their law be served better with their prescribed sentences, etc., letting AI judge it? Well, that's just a bit of speculation thrown in there. My point is that the money-making occupations of our time, and don't forget, I'm Generation X, so I was screwed all around. I was screwed by the boomers. I was screwed by the millennials. I feel like my generation deserves a special seat at this because we were really screwed both ways. The boomers wouldn't relinquish to us, and immediately the millennials trampled right over the top of us. And that's a Generation X complaint. But with that huge change from industrialism, what are people going to be doing to earn a crust? As we've seen at the moment, the major industries, that seem to be in the service area and silly things like that. Well, you can imagine automation can supplant that just as quickly. A goddamn AI could make a diagnosis. I mean, so I'm saying it's not just at the blue collar end. I suppose tradies are well off because, until you get such a sophisticated round of machinery that it can install sewer pipes and, patch up your tiling or whatnot. But then if you throw your reliance on that technology, what happens, when a big electromagnetic event collapses the whole bloody lot of it, and the generations are left useless. Yeah, because, well, the robot's dead. It's gone zapped out because everybody's relied on it. Finance is shut down because it's all tied to the digital banking system. And nobody knows how to build a house or to kill a chook or how to grow an ear.
That's one of the problems. I won't give the details, but there's a gentleman who is putting together some courses for people in a certain place, certain environment, And a lot of people, he asked someone, he said, oh, look, I'm not a US-style survivalist, but how would you start a fire? And what if your car didn't work? How would you know? And this is one of the problems of technologies. And I do notice that one of the interesting things of generationalism, some of the older people can fix a car, some of the young guys can't, and they've never been asked to. So there's a lot of things that take place. How do you get water?
That's the point. That's the point. You can go to your basic survivalism, like how do you start fire, where do you collect wood, water to survive. But then there's the next stage. How do I get the electricity running again? How do I do it? Because obviously we don't want to go back to hunting and gathering and end up like that horrible movie from the 80s, Threads, you know, the post-nuclear apocalyptic vision of the world. So, you know, these questions bookend the entirety of the discussion we're happening. It's all a choice of which baby you throw out with the
which bathwater. But one very important point with this, bringing it back to politics, with issues of generationalism, which are played upon by new groups to distort the whole process, is that the groups that already exist, and I'll say this as a general principle, have to make themselves more intelligible and more interesting so they grab the attention. If they do not do this, the attention can go anywhere, and it can be very, very badly, very badly misled.
They've also got to have answers for bigger questions, you know, like this whole, well, we'll remove them. And like Nick said earlier, reducing their nationals discussion to this one area, one issue, without asking, well, wait on, all right, let's assume that we've got our own people here. How do we provision for them? You know, let's assume that there's backlash from the Zionist occupied America for what we're doing, and we can't get certain amounts of these materials. We need to do this. What are we going to do in that stead? How are we going to defend ourselves if we've got reduced capacity? How do we make it? You know, they do not. No, holistic nationalism, I call it holistic nationalism, where you consider the society you want to create before you get into silly little nailed down to silly little prejudices before, you know, entertaining the enormousness of what you're really entering into. I mean, if these tweets entered government for a start, they'd be relying on the same bureaucrats that'd be working against it because they wouldn't know how to run it. So there, right away, you've got to get rid of that bureaucracy. You've got to get rid of that system. You've got to. So what do you do?
That doesn't arise. That doesn't arise in that particular discourse. It's not actually part of it, and that's one of the things I find very, very interesting. That very little thought's been given to what happens on day two, and no thought. So I suppose we have this problem of dealing with this, and unfortunately at the moment, I hate to say it, but the enemies have more weapons in their hands than we do, and it's something to be very aware of, I suppose.
Well, Nick, I can think of that.
I was going to say, I think that for nationalists to be relevant, there's possibly a good future show, because we're running over time here now. We cannot possibly deal with the Euro Harari question, and it's actually a very valid question of what do you do with working class people when all the work has been done by robots. It is and then how do you deal with the money, etc. So the question that nationalists can make themselves very relevant is to take on board, because everyone is going to understand the demographic issue, you know, shortly. It's becoming so huge it cannot be avoided, and you can't talk about immigration without understanding it, etc., etc. So as that sinks into people, two things occur. I think, well, people have to want answers to two things. One, in an ideal world, what system do we have that will work? And at that point, you look at the combination of, as I've been said a number of times in this show, the combination of demographics and the money system, and work from, and we've got a heritage of an understanding of the problem of the money system and capitalism from a non-Marxist, non-crackpot point of view. So perhaps it would be very useful if we could say, right, this is the problem that's going to develop. In 100 years' time, this is the answer, and we've got it. Have they? No. And then the other thing is to say, right, well, what must nationalists do now, this year, next year, and in 10 years' time, to help our people and people like us and our ideas be there in 100 years' time? And at that point, you can then, if that's worked out, you've got a long-term answer and you've got a practical program of things we're going to do now, which, for instance, can include, and it's rather fun as well, Jim, you're talking about, someone running, courses on things to do and so on. I think it's a really good thing. Young men should know how to change a tire, how to use a chainsaw, how to do basic welding and so on. One, because if things go wrong on the double Black Death path, which we are irrevocably on, then everything is going to bloody collapse, and then you need basic skills. But even if things don't go wrong, it's a matter of giving young men a pride and a purpose and a sense of identity and a roundness of being, which comes from knowing how to do things and how to look after their family. It's a combination. It starts at recreation and then becomes really necessary. And if nationalist organisations are doing things like that,
yes.
And then collecting money and effort and so on to buy a premises somewhere where they can do these sort of things and grow some cabbages, not because they're going to try and feed everybody, but just to show people how to grow cabbages and so on. And some people will want to grow cabbages, others won't. So I think there is a lot that nationalists could do if we face this problem head on and really, talk it through and work it out. We can then be able to say we've got the long-term answer, and in the meantime, we're going to do this, and it's going to be fun. It's going to be good.
Well,
Right.
Yeah, just before I wind it all up and let us all go on our way, I'll say that it's going to be an interesting problem for the left, isn't it? They're using these anachronistic terms of reference, the workers. You go, well, that's an industrial era phenomenon. You haven't been paying attention to what's going on. That's one point. Another thing I was going to say you could do, Nick, is write a book about your political experience, And indeed,
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And I think that would be very interesting. Your time with, it could educate a lot of these fools as to the pitfalls and the reality of a political road that's determined by a system that exists explicitly to keep you out, right? Its whole design is to not let you in. And the automatic cry of people is, who can I vote for to change it? How can we get someone in without realising you've got to get rid of Parliament? You've got to get rid of
the problem, Nathan, isn't to write. The problem isn't to write books. The problem is to sell books. That's the issue.
Yes.
Well, their books have to exist because while they might not have a market today, they may be of great demand tomorrow, my friend. And
I've seen the time machine. I know what happens.
Excellent.
Don't forget that's what I do is write books. I'm writing one at the moment about Jim's experience with National Action, which I began to sort of tell the true story about how he was framed for certain crimes. And then looking at it, I realised this was much more than that at all. It was, in fact, the genesis of the Australia as an anti-racist country. And what they were was engaged in a propaganda war. I originally said for multicultural Australia, but I realised, no, it was for anti-fascist Australia. And this is the book. It will be incendiary. I'm sure it will be banned on any platforms. But a good book for anyone attacking the topic of where to go here would run with the title. Jim just came up with their Day 2. I like that, Day 2. What comes next? A speculative account of these things. Well, gentlemen, I think we've been round the universe and back tonight.
Yeah, I think so.
We've been everywhere. We've been to the Middle East. We've been to the Ukraine. We've been inside the shady passages of the Five Eyes, and all we are left with is
And we've been to the future.
That's
yeah,
right.
and the future. We visited the future. We went back to the future. That could be the name of the program. Nationalists go back to the future. And so till the next time, all we do is leave ourselves having just whetted the appetite for more penetrating investigation and discussion. But so, gentlemen, I will bid thy good morning, good night, or whatever the hell.
Morning, good night, and we'll meet again.
See you again.
Catch you later. Good night.
Okay.